Jen says they did it again. Another healthcare ad that's overrated. Tom says you're losing your touch. The press is underused and not outdated. Killer public relations, marketing, and social media in healthcare requires making the right moves at the right time. Welcome to the Overrated and Underused show. Here's your hosts, experienced marketers Jennings and Testa, with special guest Adrian Stoner. Overrated and underused. The Overrated and Underused show.
Welcome everyone to our latest episode of O&U, and Jen and I have another great show lined up for you folks. And Jen, this is a big deal right now. You know, I think the O&U green room is a buzz because we've got some exciting stuff happening on today's show.
Yes, I feel like every episode is a grand episode, but I'm very excited about this one because it will be our first guest.
Today we're going to have our good friend and someone that's very familiar to this radio station, Flagg. And she'll be joining us in a second or two. But again, we've got a great show. We're going to talk a little bit about HIMSS and what Carol and her team are doing at HIMSS later on this month. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about voice marketing. And so we've got a lot going on with Carol, and we're welcome to have her here.
Yeah, I think no better way to discuss all that there is with voice marketing, audio content, radio shows, podcasts, and get into those details is through an actual radio show. So we're bringing that content here.
All right. Well, enough of us. Now coming to the show, we have Carol Flagg. Carol is managing partner of Answers Media Network, where she leads the company's marketing, sales, and social media initiatives. She has more than 25 years experience in traditional and digital media. She also hosts What's My Tagline, which airs on HealthcareNOW radio. Carol, welcome to the show.
Oh, great to be on. Hi, Jen. Hi, Tom. Thanks so much for allowing me to kind of share some chit chat today with you.
Yeah, nice. We have the real expert in the room, so you can show us how it's done.
Oh, I don't know about that.
And I'd like to say that Carol, she effectively launched our careers because we were a guest on her show, and I think from there, Jen, boom, ratings skyrocketed once we were on What's My Tagline, right? I mean, that was great, Carol. It's great that we can have you join us now to return the favor.
Yeah. Oh, you're going to make me a star now.
That's it.
I mean, we didn't negotiate this, but I think we'll find a recurring segment for you.
Yes. I'll have
Don't tell Adrian.
I won't tell Adrian. I'll make sure my agent gets my writer to you in due haste.
Yes, Tom mentioned a green room. We didn't talk about the extensive writer that we had to fill out.
That's right.
And all the only blue M&Ms are allowed.
Oh yeah,
and cappuccino.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Difficult guest if we've ever had one before. Trust me. Learned our lessons. We're one and done with the guests. But Carol, honestly, thank you for joining us. So, Jen and I were just talking. We were teasing how, of course, HIMSS is happening out in Vegas this month. And you have something big going on out there that O&U will be a part of. If you want to talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes. So we're going to be bringing HealthcareNOW Radio as a studio to the exhibit floor at HIMSS. We're going to be in booth 3700, Exhibit Hall C, and the idea and concept behind the studio is to invite our radio hosts, right, the radio show hosts from Overrated and Underused, to do episodes of their shows in the studio. And we're going to be live streaming over YouTube, and we're going to be having a lot of great conversations throughout the entire time that the exhibit floor is open. So we're pretty excited, just by the depth of the content and people that we'll be interviewing, and B, to be having quite a few of our radio hosts on hand, conducting these interviews and catching up in person after a long stint with COVID, obviously.
Right.
Yeah, no, I'm excited, and I'm excited to be a part of it and the conversations. And I think just the whole concept of, this is happening at HIMSS, but future events, I think it's a great idea just to, obviously you've been doing radio interviews, at conferences like HIMSS and other industry conferences for years, but to have the on-floor studio is going to be something really great to be a part of.
Yeah, this is a pretty big leap up for us. And so, we think it's a leap that will be like a permanent leap in the sense that, this will be what we'll be doing, I think, as these large scale conferences and maybe even medium scale conferences get back on track as the pandemic, I don't want to say wanes and winds down, but certainly moves into this new phase of live in-person events.
And this kind of format, although it's no stranger to a lot of folks, I think it'll be great for folks to see it firsthand too. I mean,
Yes.
people seeing it, and again, you put a microphone in someone's face, especially for a radio program, and even Jen and I know, if you go back to one of our first couple of programs, it was like first time we're learning to speak. It was like paralyzing when you put it in front of us. I think seeing it in person and who knows, it could open the door for not just future radio hosts, but also guests on programs and things like that. So seeing how they can share their voice, and that it's a great platform to do so.
Agreed. We're jazzed.
Great. So now, Jen, again, this is something we've talked about on past shows too. And I think having Carol here as an expert in this is where the meat of our conversation here. It's really a lot into the voice marketing, element. And as us, Jen and I, we're marketers too at the heart of it. And so this is what we've turned to, a new platform from us is voice marketing. Again, to start things off, why does radio podcasting continue to be underused in healthcare marketing? Or do you disagree with that?
Underused.
If we step back and sort of look at what's happened in the last 18 months, I think that, there has been a sizable growth curvature in what we sort of define as recorded audio content. And that is in the form of either radio content that streams, digitally, like the shows on HealthcareNOW Radio, like OU, as well as in the form of podcasts, right? And so I think, it was a kind of a growing trend anyway for content marketers to be focused in on audio content, which comes under the big umbrella of voice marketing. It was a focus before COVID, but certainly, the start of COVID, this, lack of in-person conferences, and all of a sudden, no pun intended, content marketers and thought leaders were looking to find a voice, right?
Right.
And, the growth of podcasts in general and internet radio is being driven by smart speakers, smartphones, plug and play cars. I mean, it's never been simpler for a person to stream internet radio or digital radio and or to listen to podcasts. And so I think a lot of, what's happened is just like anything, content marketers are responding, even in healthcare and even in the B2B space that we occupy. But there's lots of room to grow. And I think that what's happening right now is conversations that I hear from content marketers is, wow, there are so many podcasts out there. And that's one issue. Or two, there's just a lack of commitment to the bandwidth part of creating good quality audio content, whether it's a radio show or a podcast only show. It is a brain trust investment, not so much an expensive investment, but it's got to be quality content. You just don't want to put out a piece of audio that, can be discovered in Apple and can be streamed over an internet radio platform like ours, that isn't a quality, doesn't have a unique point of view, doesn't have host that recognizes this is theater, and it's not a dry kind of environment, right?
Right.
And so those are sometimes stumbling blocks that I hear from content marketers as to perhaps keeping them from dipping their toe into audio content. They know that it has to be a frequency issue. It just can't be done on an ad hoc basis. There has to be a release schedule. There has to be real interest in doing this on a regular basis. They've got to have the right hosts or people engaged in the process, and they've got to find a unique point of view. And that perhaps is the trickiest part of all. There's lots of topics to talk about in our industry in healthcare. There's no shortage of that, but it's really a question of who's the audience you're looking to reach, and what is going to be your point of view? What are you bringing and adding to the conversation? And I think that's where the real nuances come into play.
You're right. We're not sitting up here reading a white paper or a press release, in terms of the discussion that's taking place. And that's why I think these are great. Again, having a discussion with someone, an expert like yourself, or Jen and I will have discussions as well, talking about things that ideally people aren't hearing elsewhere. Something where ideally you might not hear this perspective on it. Anyway, this take on it. I think that's where things might get maybe people get a little bit scared at, or so to speak, or hesitant on. Am I offering the right take on it? Is it something different or fresh, right? I mean, do you agree with that maybe they don't have to try so hard to have a fresh take on things? Just a good analysis on it in general, it would get you through the day?
Well, some of that unique POV that I reference really relates even back to the host or hosts. Like they have to bring something to the table, right? I talk a lot about how the content could be interesting, it could be good, But if the radio host or hosts aren't engaging and they don't have a particular style, or they don't have a particular point of view as to what they're talking about,
Right.
then I think that it's going to be just harder to attract, I think, a regular listening, following, an audience. Again, getting back to this fact that it's sort of entertainment, and if you were a band or a musician and you're putting out music, you want your music to be unique and it resonate with you, right? You don't want it to sound like everybody else's music out there. And that's really the trick. And I'm going to plug you guys for a second, because you've done a great job with that, from point of view and the angle that you take for your own show. But B, just as an agency in this space, you actually are able to work with clients to do that, to find their unique voice and sort of, uncover that. You do that anyways, just in general, what you're trying to do when you're setting up speaking engagements and trying to get interviews and earn media opportunities. I'm just saying it takes that same sort of dedication and focus to create quality audio content that feels right.
Yeah, I will say, we kind of have this unique perspective in that, we are host of our own show, but also we are, an agency that helps our clients host their own shows and podcasts behind the scenes. So we kind of know all that is involved in the back end of everything. But it's certainly a commitment, but I think it's one of those things where we really believe in audio content. And I think that's why we're, practicing what we preach, and we're joining the group of audio voice marketers, radio show hosts, is because, we really thought that was the way of the future of getting content out there, versus take us back a decade. And it was, starting your own blog was a new thing. And, it was companies saying, well, can I commit to this posting schedule and, writing the content and putting it, it's the same theory and like steps that you really got to have that commitment to the project. It's just a newer way of letting your messages be heard.
And I was just going to say what I love too about the oral word versus the written word in this case. It's almost like some sort of subliminal messaging too, because you can be multitasking. You can have like overrated and underused on in the background while you're still working away on other things too. It's almost like, right? I love that you can certainly be driving in your car or going for a run and have your favorite radio show or podcast on. But I love the idea that you can also have it kind of multitasking as well, educating yourself in some way while you're also working on the day job.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting because, what you're talking about, it really speaks to this engagement level with audio content. Years ago, when Jen, you were talking about people started company blogs, right? That was the big thing and every vertical got into it. And, those Google Analytics showed that people were reading these articles, but Google Analytics also shows today that engagement in the written word is down. Some of that is just, the smartphone's perhaps not an elegant place to read a 2,000 word article, perhaps, I don't, but maybe others do. But on the grand scheme of things, when you think about audio content, and we'll just use HealthcareNOW Radio as an example. Now that's a streaming radio station, so it's very easy to engage it and listen to it into the background on a smart speaker or your media device. But our numbers show that the average listener tunes in for 48 minutes. And in today's digital environment, 48 minutes is a long, long, long time. That's the average.
Those are some impressive numbers. And I know you have some great analytics to back it up there. So what other kinds of, return on investment for folks looking to get into voice marketing?
ROI means different things to different people. Audio content by itself is not really a gated environment. If you're doing a podcast show, you don't ever want to gate it. It's just, that's not going to help you. The idea of doing audio content, if it's a radio show, is to be easily found and streamable. If it's a podcast show, it's, make it easy to find in Apple and Spotify and Stitcher and, all these people find their podcast. So right away, it's not gateable. And so it becomes a thought leader environment, much like an article would be, or a speaking engagement at a conference. You could even say sort of like a webinar, although obviously webinars are there to capture lead generation. But the idea from an ROI standpoint is to think about it as a branding opportunity for your company and your company thought leader to be viewed as a peer or an expert on whatever subject they're talking about. So the ROI is sort of a longer tail kind of process. So it's not like putting out an asset. Instead, it's about taking a person in your company, making them a recognizable name and a voice in the market in whatever slice of that pie that you're trying to carve into. Big picture thing, just from an ROI standpoint, is that as a marketer, you have to be thinking about voice marketing, which is kind of what we sort of led into this and what that means. And, from a simple definition, voice marketing is using a voice command to find content. And so you have to be thinking about, well, all right, if I do a radio show or I do a podcast show, how is Alexa going to find that content? How is Siri going to find that content? You have to make this content readily available so that if I ask a command to find a particular show, that I'm going to get the result that your show comes up, right? Or otherwise you've got some work behind that you've got to do. So, voice marketing recognizes that people are moving away very fast to asking AI-driven technology to find content for them. So that ROI in that particular arena is really related to where we collectively as a culture, right, have moved. And, as we've embraced smartphones and smart speakers, this is where we've moved to. And so I have to, from an ROI standpoint, begin to think about how I'm going to engage my content on that level.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Overrated and Underused on Healthcare Now Radio. Today's episode, we are talking about radio shows and podcasts with our very special guest, Carol Flagg. So Carol, we've talked a little bit about voice marketing and podcasting, radio shows being underused overall, but are there specific aspects that you would call overrated?
Overrated.
Yeah. I have a couple thoughts on that. First being, as somebody that listens to a lot of audio content, as you can imagine, there are shows that I stumble across in our industry where the focus is more or less not on true education, not on positioning the thought leader and their point of view, but more about talking about the company's products and services. So, it does become one long infomercial or mostly infomercial. And that is a misstep. And I think that perhaps, the marketing teams behind that are just overrating their audience's interest in listening to 20 or 30 minutes, right, about what your company is doing. So I think that's an issue. I think the other thing that perhaps as some of these companies start down this path and they start with unrealistic expectations, they're overrating their ability to make an impact in the marketplace as quickly as they think they possibly can. When you get into audio content, and I'll do radio aside because those are built-in numbers based on the radio station, but let's just say podcast only. You're doing a podcast show and you put this effort into it and you release it and you somehow think you're going to get thousands of plays, no, Oprah gets thousands of plays, right?
Yep.
You're not going to get thousands of plays. You might release and put yourself in the 10 biggest podcast networks and even tell your newsletter folks of this episode, and you might get 30, 40, 50 plays, right? So I think that understand what those expectations are when you start on this path, do your research. There's a stat, and it's really true, if you have a podcast and your show per episode gets anywhere from 100 to 200 plays per episode, you are in the top 5% of all podcasts in the world. So think about that, right?
Wow.
So if 1 to 200 plays per episode puts you in the top 5%, right? Understand what those expectations are. Don't overrate your ability to move that needle, all right? Because it's going to start out slow. It's going to take time and effort. If the quality's there, if the host is good and it's entertaining and you keep up the frequency of it, you will build a following and that audience will grow, but just be a realistic path.
Great. And I think we're going to have to wrap things up with you. But before we do, the question for me is, if you get your crystal ball out, where do you see voice marketing going? Where do you see this in 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, yeah. There's annual research that comes out every single March called the Infinite Dial, and you can Google it and find it readily available. And they've been putting out a report for the last 15 or 20 years. And the report monitors and follows trends in a lot of different areas, including social media as an example. But it does focus quite a bit of its attention on audio content and specifically on internet streaming radio and podcasts. And they've been tracking these trends now for a number of years. And you can clearly see from the research this shift that has happened from 10 years ago where the average, podcast listener was 12, right? It's just, it was music oriented and it was very youth oriented. And both internet radio and podcast listenership has both grown in sheer numbers, but also as far as the demographics go, it's gotten older populations are listening to audio content. And again, no surprise given smartphones, smart speakers, and plug and play cars. It's just never been easier to find and stream audio content. And according to Infinite Dial, they don't see this appetite for audio content going anywhere but up at least into 2025. So that's where they're sort of, as they look down the road, they think this is going to continue at least until 2025. So it's not too late to get into this market, right? There's plenty of opportunity to get into it. And I would argue that it doesn't matter what form it's in, good quality content always rises above.
Wow, who knew, Jen? We're finally part of a rising trend. Finally.
Clinicians Corner.
So, Tom and I work alongside a lot of healthcare technology vendors and that side of it. But really, we like to focus our Clinicians Corner segment on advice direct for providers and practices. In your opinion, what do you think would be good content for a provider as they're trying to get their messages out to prospective patients, that kind of more clinical side of the industry?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And I'm going to lead back into the research from the Infinite Dial, which says about 144 million people in the US listen to podcasts. So that's over half of America tuning in. So that's just a good way to think about this from a profession standpoint. If you're a doctor, well, if half of America is listening to a podcast, is there a way for me to take advantage of audio content? I guess the first thing I would ask myself if I were a physician and I were going to start, let's just say a podcast show, sort of an easier entree into growing an audience for audio content than perhaps a radio show. But I would start with trying to determine who is my intended audience. Is my intended audience patients? Am I going to be educating patients and talking directly to the patient about these particular challenges or issues around healthcare? Or is my intended audience going to be more peer audience, that I'm looking to have these conversations to engage my fellow peers in? Because that's going to determine the direction that I go in. Because understanding that when you start putting content out there that is consumer driven, right, what that would be talking directly to the patient, that might take a little bit longer and a little bit more frequency, I think, in order to attract a listening audience and followers, versus if you're thinking, well, I want to have these engaging conversations where I'm getting my peers involved so that perhaps I'm increasing my exposure and my presence in whatever particular part of the healthcare field that I occupy. That's a different tact, right? And that's a different kind of process, I think, for finding the listeners to your show, just because it is more peer oriented. It's a difference of writing an article for a peer reviewed journal, I guess, as a doctor versus, maybe going on a local TV show to talk to patients directly.
Right.
Well, that's a good analogy there.
Yeah, and I think, Carol, too, talking about the peer-to-peer stuff that you were mentioning too, and I think that's why voice marketing for a provider, it's a different kind of mindset. And I love how you drew parallels to like a lot of the PR stuff, like thought leadership with byline article writing and other ways of thought leadership. Because hosts, I would imagine, sure doesn't want to have people come on and say, "Oh, doctor, I have a pain in my lower abdomen. What do you think it is?" I mean, they're not offering clinical diagnosis. They're there to offer that thought leadership. So the mindset, right, has to be a little bit different there overall versus providing advice.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say, it's sort of like audio content 101. Like there are 10 things you need to be thinking about before you journey down this path. And the first thing is you have to ask yourself, who's your intended audience?
Right.
That's what it all starts with, is who's your intended audience, right?
That's great.
I would say there are a lot of podcasts out there that get started and they wither on the vine because perhaps that overrated part that we talked about, where they just think, oh my gosh, I'm going to put this, and it could be really great stuff and they can put it out there, but understand, especially in the B2B space, right? Where your audience numbers are just generally smaller anyway than they are the consumer space, right? I think there's a disappointment there, and have a realistic expectation and understand that it's going to take time and effort to get it launched and to get it growing and put the work in to make that happen.
Right. Yeah, I think, certainly anybody can have the best of intentions and the best idea, but if the follow through is not there, then, it's not going to be successful. It's one of those kind of ongoing nurture type programs. We look at it in the same way in like social media. You're not going to build, this robust following of tens of hundreds of thousands of followers overnight. You're gradually building listeners, you're building, but you're doing that through continual content and, good content, putting things out there that resonate with, your targeted audience. So
that's a great analogy.
We've talked forever today, it feels like, but we are so happy to have had you. Thank you so much, Carol, for joining us. And
thank you. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, you are the number one fan.
I'm a number one fan.
ONU groupies. There's also Tom's mom is there. But,
that's about it. Yeah. And she's only a half listener, I think. That's where I got the multitasking mom.
Yeah.
And then my husband.
There you go. There you go. Every show needs its super fans.
Yes.
Love it. Love it.
Thank you guys so much for having me on the show today.
Yes.
Thanks, Carol.
And so thanks to Carol and our listeners for joining us today. We are sponsored by Anderson Interactive and can be heard weekdays at 10 a.m., 6 p.m. and 2 a.m. Eastern on Healthcare Now Radio. You can email your inbox with Adrian questions to hello@AndersonI, that's the letter I.com, or tweet us at Jen_Jennings, Tom_Testa, or Adrian_Stoner, and follow us with the hashtag #OverUnderRadio.
Thanks for listening to the Overrated and Underused show with your hosts, experienced marketers Jen Jennings and Tom Testa, and special guest Adrian Stoner. Over